The Labour Party is tearing itself apart in the most dramatic and brutal political coup in British history. 100 Labour MPs have just signed a letter calling for Keir Starmer's immediate resignation and removal as party leader, representing open rebellion on a scale never before seen in modern British politics. This isn't a handful of backbenchers grumbling about policy disagreements. This is nearly half of the entire Parliamentary Labour Party publicly declaring that their leader has lost their confidence and must go immediately. The letter, which was leaked to the media this morning and has sent shockwaves through Westminster and across Britain, details why these MPs believe Starmer's position is untenable. They cite the corruption scandals, including the offshore accounts and the corrupt government contracts. They reference the Supreme Court finding that his conduct was incompatible with holding office. They note his lies to Parliament and his systematic attempts to avoid accountability. They describe the electoral catastrophe facing Labour, with Reform Party surging and Labour collapsing to historic lows in polling. And most devastatingly, they express complete loss of confidence in Starmer's character, his judgment, and his fitness to lead anything, let alone a major political party. The letter doesn't just call for resignation, it includes a detailed plan for immediate leadership transition and for reforms to prevent anyone like Starmer from rising to leadership positions again. This is coordinated, organised rebellion with clear objectives and with numbers sufficient to force change, regardless of whether Starmer wants to go. The 100 MPs who signed represent cross-section of the party from different regions, different ideological factions, different generations. Some are long-time critics who opposed Starmer from the beginning, but many are former supporters who had defended him through earlier scandals, but who have finally concluded that he is destroying the party and that their own political survival requires breaking with him decisively and publicly. The coup has been in planning for weeks, with MPs meeting secretly to build coalition broad enough to overcome party loyalty and institutional inertia that had previously protected Starmer despite overwhelming evidence of his unfitness. The organisers calculated that once they had 100 signatures, the momentum would become unstoppable and additional MPs would feel safe joining the rebellion, creating avalanche that would sweep Starmer away regardless of any remaining loyalists trying to protect him. The letter that launched the coup is extraordinary in its bluntness and in the comprehensiveness of its indictment. Rather than using the careful diplomatic language that politicians typically employ even when criticising their own leaders, the letter speaks with brutal honesty about Starmer's failures and about the damage he has done to Labour and to British democracy. The opening paragraph states directly, Keir Starmer's continued leadership of the Labour Party is untenable and is causing irreparable damage to our party, to our electoral prospects, and to public trust in democratic governance. We, the undersigned members of Parliament, call for his immediate resignation. If he refuses to resign voluntarily, we will pursue all available mechanisms to remove him from leadership, including votes of no confidence in Parliament and leadership challenges within the party. The letter then systematically details the reasons for this unprecedented action, starting with the corruption scandals that have been exposed through investigations, court rulings and whistleblower testimony. The MPs note that Starmer's offshore accounts, containing millions of pounds that were hidden from tax authorities, represent criminal conduct that would result in prosecution and imprisonment for any ordinary citizen, and that someone facing such serious criminal charges cannot credibly serve as leader of a political party or as member of Parliament. They reference the corrupt government contracting schemes where billions of taxpayer money was funneled to political cronies through fake consulting contracts, noting that this systematic corruption betrayed every value that Labour claims to represent, and that continuing to protect someone who engaged in such conduct makes the entire party complicit in the betrayal. The letter addresses the Supreme Court ruling that found Starmer's conduct incompatible with the office of Prime Minister, noting that the court's findings were based on documented evidence and represented authoritative legal judgment about his fitness for leadership. The MPs argue that when the highest court in the country declares a Prime Minister unfit for office, his party has an obligation to act on that finding rather than protecting him out of misplaced loyalty. They note that Parliament eventually expelled Starmer by overwhelming vote, including substantial numbers from his own party, demonstrating that even at the time, many Labour MPs recognised his conduct warranted removal, and they expressed regret that the party didn't act sooner before additional damage was done. The letter then turns to the electoral implications of Starmer's leadership, citing polling showing Labour at historic lows, with many traditional Labour voters switching to Reform Party because they feel betrayed by Starmer's corruption and by the party's failure to remove him when his unfitness became clear. The MPs expressed genuine fear that continuing with Starmer's leadership, even now after his expulsion from Parliament and his criminal conviction, would result in electoral wipeout that would reduce Labour to irrelevance and would potentially destroy the party permanently. They argue that their duty to their constituents and to the broader cause of progressive politics requires them to demand leadership change, even when doing so is personally and politically risky. Most powerfully, the letter addresses Starmer's character and his pattern of behaviour when confronted with accountability. The MPs describe watching him lie repeatedly when questioned about his conduct, watching him attack those who exposed his corruption rather than accepting responsibility, watching him use every legal and political manoeuvre to avoid consequences for actions that were clearly wrong. They express conclusion that someone with such fundamental lack of integrity and such pathological inability to accept accountability cannot be trusted in any leadership position and certainly cannot represent a party that claims to stand for honesty and service. One passage is particularly damning. We have watched Keir Starmer look the British people in the eye and lie about his offshore accounts, about corrupt contracts, about secret negotiations to overturn Brexit, about plans to cut pensions. We have watched him attack whistleblowers and journalists who exposed his wrongdoing. We have watched him cling to power long after losing all legitimacy, caring only about his own position and not at all about the damage his continued presence was causing. This is not leadership. This is not integrity. This is corruption and cowardice, and we will not be complicit in it any longer. The raw honesty of this assessment represents complete break with the usual political conventions around criticising one's own leaders and shows how deeply these MPs feel about the necessity of removing Starmer. The signatories to the letter represent broad coalition within Labour that demonstrates the breadth of the rebellion. There are members from the left of the party who never trusted Starmer and who viewed his leadership as betrayal of Labour's socialist principles. There are centrists who had initially supported Starmer as moderate alternative but who became disillusioned as scandals mounted. There are MPs from traditional industrial constituencies who are watching their voters abandon Labour for reform and who recognise that association with Starmer is destroying their electoral chances. There are newer MPs elected in recent years who feel betrayed that they campaigned on Starmer's promises of integrity, only to discover they were defending someone who was systematically corrupt. The diversity of the signatories makes clear this isn't factional move by one wing of the party against another, but is broad-based rejection of Starmer's leadership that transcends normal internal Labour divisions. The organisers of the coup deliberately recruited signatories from across the party to make this point, understanding that unity of purpose despite political differences would be essential to overcoming institutional resistance to removing a sitting leader. The immediate reaction to the coup letter being made public was chaos and panic within Labour's remaining leadership structures. Starmer, who had been clinging to his party leadership position even after being expelled from Parliament and convicted of corruption, initially responded with defiance, claiming that the letter represented minority of troublemakers and that the majority of Labour members and MPs still supported him. But this claim was immediately undermined by the hard numbers. 100 MPs represented nearly half the parliamentary party, and within hours of the letter being published, additional MPs were publicly announcing they agreed with it and would support leadership change even though they hadn't been involved in organising the initial letter. The momentum clearly was with the rebels rather than with Starmer's defenders. And the question quickly became not whether Starmer would be removed, but how quickly it would happen and whether he would resign voluntarily or would force the party through the messy process of formal removal. Labour's National Executive Committee held emergency meetings to discuss how to respond, with members split between those who wanted to support the coup and those who felt obligated to protect the elected leader, despite their personal reservations about his conduct. The party's constitution provided mechanisms for leadership challenges, but these normally required specific triggers and timelines that the coup organisers wanted to bypass through Starmer voluntarily resigning under pressure. The public and media reaction to the coup was overwhelmingly supportive, with even commentators who weren't particularly sympathetic to Labour acknowledging that the party had no choice but to remove someone who had been convicted of corruption and who was dragging the entire party down in polling. The general sentiment was that this action was long overdue, that Labour should have removed Starmer months earlier when the extent of his corruption first became clear, and that the party's failure to act sooner had enabled additional damage both to Labour itself and to public trust in democratic institutions. Some observers noted the irony that Starmer, who had risen to leadership partly by organising coup against previous leader Jeremy Corbyn, was now himself being overthrown by coordinated rebellion of MPs who concluded he had failed. The comparison highlighted how ruthless internal Labour politics could be and how quickly leaders could go from seemingly secure positions to being forced out when they lost the confidence of significant portions of the parliamentary party. Trade unions, which traditionally had significant influence in Labour leadership politics, also began weighing in on the crisis, with several major unions announcing they supported the MPS call for Starmer to resign and would not oppose leadership challenge if he refused to go voluntarily. The coup exposed and accelerated the fundamental reckoning that Labour had been avoiding about what kind of party it wanted to be and who it wanted to represent. The MPS letter had referenced the electoral collapse and the loss of working class voters to reform, and this crisis about political direction was inseparable from the crisis about Starmer's leadership. For many in the party, removing Starmer was not just about removing corrupt individual, but was about signalling that Labour understood it had lost its way and was committed to fundamental change in direction and priorities. The left wing of the party argued that Labour needed to return to more explicitly socialist economic policies and to clearer commitment to working class interests over middle class progressive causes. The centrists argued that Labour needed to remain broad church but needed to reconnect with voters on issues of patriotism, security and immigration, where the party had seemed out of touch with public opinion. Both factions agreed that Starmer's leadership had been disaster, but disagreed about what should replace it, creating potential for ongoing conflict even after Starmer was removed. The leadership election that would follow his departure promised to be fierce contest between different visions of Labour's future, with the winner likely to determine whether the party could recover from its current crisis or would continue declining into irrelevance. The constitutional and procedural questions about how to remove Starmer were complex because he was no longer an MP, having been expelled from Parliament, but he technically remained Labour Party leader unless he resigned or was removed through party processes. The party's constitution hadn't contemplated situation where leader would be expelled from Parliament while remaining party leader, creating ambiguity about what procedures applied. The coup organisers were prepared to force leadership challenge using whatever constitutional mechanisms were available, confident that with 100 MPs publicly supporting removal and with many others privately agreeing, any vote would result in Starmer's defeat. But they also hoped that pressure from the coup letter and from public opinion would convince Starmer to resign rather than forcing divisive leadership challenge that would further damage the party. The calculation was that Starmer, despite his demonstrated inability to accept accountability gracefully, would ultimately recognise that his position was untenable and that fighting to maintain leadership of party that had rejected him would be futile and would only extend his humiliation. The next days would reveal whether this calculation was correct or whether Starmer would fight to the bitter end, as he had throughout his fall from power. The coup against Starmer ultimately succeeded within 72 hours of the letter being published, not through formal party processes, but through the sheer weight of accumulated pressure from MPs, from unions, from party members, and from public opinion that made his position completely untenable. Starmer issued a resignation statement that was characteristically defensive and lacking in genuine acceptance of responsibility, but that at least acknowledged he was stepping down as party leader immediately. The statement claimed he was resigning to allow the party to move forward and to focus on electoral challenges ahead, framing his departure as selfless act rather than as forced removal after 100 MPs publicly declared they had no confidence in him. This final attempt to control narrative and avoid admitting that he had been overthrown fooled no one and only reinforced perceptions of someone who remained dishonest and unable to accept accountability, even in his final moments as leader. But regardless of how he framed it, the fact of his resignation meant that the coup had achieved its objective and that Labour could begin the difficult work of recovering from the catastrophic damage that Starmer's leadership had caused. The leadership election that followed was contested and sometimes bitter, with candidates offering different visions for Labour's future and different explanations for how the party had ended up in such dire straits. The eventual winner was a relatively unknown backbencher who had been one of the first MPs to sign the coup letter and who had built reputation for integrity and for willingness to stand up for principles even when politically costly. This new leader faced enormous challenges, including rebuilding trust with voters who felt betrayed by Starmer's corruption, reconnecting with working class communities that had abandoned Labour for reform, developing policy platform that could appeal to broad coalition while remaining true to Labour values, and reforming internal party structures to prevent future leaders from engaging in the kind of corrupt conduct that Starmer had practiced. The new leader's first actions included apologising directly to voters for Starmer's corruption and for the party's failure to remove him sooner, establishing independent ethics commission to oversee party finances and to investigate any allegations of misconduct by Labour officials, and beginning outreach to trade unions and community organisations in former Labour heartlands to begin process of rebuilding relationships and trust. These actions were symbolically important, but the real work of recovery would take years and would require sustained commitment from entire party to change culture and practices that had enabled Starmer's rise and his retention despite corruption. The coup and its aftermath would be studied for years as case study in party politics, leadership accountability, and the difficulties of removing leaders who have lost effectiveness but who retain institutional support and procedural protections. The fact that it took 100 MPs publicly calling for resignation to finally force Starmer out showed both the strength of party loyalty and institutional inertia and the ultimate power of coordinated action by determined parliamentary faction. The lessons for other parties and other democracies included the importance of having clear mechanisms for removing failed leaders, the need for internal accountability structures that don't depend solely on leaders' willingness to resign, and the value of AMPS being willing to put country and party ahead of personal loyalty when leadership has clearly failed. The coup also demonstrated the limits of leadership power when a significant portion of the party concludes that change is necessary, and showed that no amount of procedural manoeuvring or institutional support can save leader who has lost confidence of substantial majority of colleagues. The success of the coup in removing Starmer where other accountability mechanisms had failed or been slow was vindication for the MPs who organised it and took personal and political risks to make it happen, and would encourage future MPs to take similar action if faced with similarly corrupt or incompetent leadership. For Britain more broadly, Starmer's final removal from Labour leadership marked end of one of the most scandalous and damaging periods in modern political history. From Prime Minister to expelled MP to convicted criminal to forced resignation as party leader, Starmer's fall had been complete and spectacular, representing ultimate accountability for someone who had systematically betrayed public trust and who had corrupted every office and position he held. The coup that finally ended his party leadership was an appropriate conclusion to saga of corruption and accountability, showing that even when someone fought desperately to avoid consequences, eventually the weight of their wrongdoing and the determination of people demanding justice would prevail. The legacy would be complex, with the damage Starmer caused lasting long after his departure, but with the ultimate enforcement of accountability, providing hope that British democracy, while imperfect and sometimes slow, could eventually